Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thanks for staying with us. The hashtag on X is Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Dr. Hassan Kanenje is director at the Horn International Institute. Ahmed Hashi is governance commentator. Dr. Maxwell Miawa is international development law scholar. And Dr. Edgar Gidua is international affairs, diplomacy and security commentator. Gentlemen, let's now turn our attention to what's happening across the world. And here is what the Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi, who as well doubles up as the Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary, said when he appeared before the Senate yesterday on Kenya's hand in the Sudan crisis.
Kenya's position has been that bring the parties to the table. Let them be brought to the table. And by them coming here was to get them to talk.
All right, that is the denial yesterday displayed by the Prime Cabinet Secretary. But to put this to you, and this is what he initially said before he appeared. He said when the RSF government formed its government here, that the RSF and Sudanese civilian groups tabling of a roadmap and proposed leadership in Nairobi is compatible with Kenya's role in peace negotiations. Certainly, Dr. Maxwell, starting with you, this isn't how a neutral party seeks to address a crisis, is it? Is it what, in the terms of Professor Rashid Khalidi, who has written extensively about the Palestine crisis, has called America as a broker of deceit?
It's a complex question, nuance, but I think somebody really has to understand international peace and diplomacy. And the way we have a lot of templates be next to our neighborhood. Kenya has done this in Somalia to a certain extent. Kenya has done this to Sudan. And I think all the time we have always done differently from the time that Moi engaged in the Sudanese peace conflict. And I think we need to follow that example. You know, flip-flopping on a critical foreign policy issue,
it's very bad,
on a country that is so significant as the Sudan, is really a tragedy in our international affairs, our international diplomacy. But I think there could probably be a conflict or perhaps lack of coordination between the bureaucrats in the Foreign Affairs Ministry and perhaps in what State House wants, and even the minister himself. And I think they really have to go back to the drawing board and relook into the issue of the Sudan. Otherwise, this kind of flip-flopping will really worsen a situation that's already bad, that is already gory. You realize that the world has ignored the Greater Sudan. Mm-hmm. There is very little discourse about the conflict in the Sudan. And as I said at the very beginning, and I think this is why Kenya also missed it at the AU Commission elections, is that whereas Kenya stands tall, by the way, among the global community in terms of its significance, in terms of the strength of its economy, but we really need to take advantage of this by giving the proper international and diplomatic stewardship. Yeah. This is something that really has to go down the minds of the people who run the foreign affairs, particularly the foreign affairs bureaucratic aspect of it, the one that can come with an advisory. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we will squander this opportunity a great deal, and it will reflect really, really badly on us. We are one stable country, and we've been stable for the longest time, but we are surrounded by instability. Yet, it is only us who can stabilize these nations, the DRC, Somalia, Southern Sudan, and now the Sudan. Can somebody really go back and sit down and relook into the issue of how Kenya can be significant in establishing peace in this area? Can somebody go back and look at the issue of international conflict, peace and security? Can we have a technocrat in that ministry who understands these things? Otherwise, this kind of flip-flopping will really put us in a very bad pedestal.
Yeah. And Dr. Kanenje, did we trip in becoming a party that would have otherwise solved one of the worst humanitarian crises, given the world's attention on regarding the war in Europe with regards to Russia and Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East? Did you squander that very opportunity to have been the party to restore stability and order and bringing all these parties together, but rather now taken sides, given what Musalia Mudavadi has said and the dichotomy of his statements previously and now?
said conflict in the Middle East. You mean the genocide in Gaza?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, of course it's the genocide in Gaza you're talking about, yeah.
Actually, don't stop laughing.
Well said.
I think the missed opportunity here on our bias has not so much been in the substance. It has been in the optics of our tactics. And the optics of our tactics in managing those perceptions, I think, is what has created a perception that actually Kenya is fundamentally, biased in the two parties. I think having worked in, this foreign policy discourse, Kenya's engagement or desire to engage in Sudan is fundamentally still part of its, peace diplomacy pillar that is critical for Kenya's foreign policy. It's a policy that it has pursued even before the Kenya's foreign policy became formalized in 2014 and then got reviewed last year. It is very critical. But I think because of the initial perceptions, especially by one of the parties to the conflict, which is the Sudanese armed forces, that Kenya is biased, we may not have done enough in terms of managing those optics. But there is no evidence that, for instance, that Nairobi has been funneling, millions of arms, to RSF. Now, what could be options, that Kenya can be able to, how can they go about it? One, Kenya cannot divorce itself from the Sudanese theater completely. Sudan is a country within our region, within our space. When things get messed up there, somehow it's going to affect us. We are, as my colleague just pointed out here, we are by far the most, stable country, but also for the longest time we've been the most credible as a neutral, arbiter. But I think progressively, one of the areas where we have missed, frankly, I say we've not sufficiently learned how to communicate better. And so, to the extent where we're now being defined by others, especially considering the optics and what they see, perception can be reality, even when it could be as hollow as anything you can think about. And so, absence of managing these optics, I think, is the one that's actually dragging us. And it's not so much because we're substantively engaged in a partisan way in Sudan. And I think that I have good confidence to be able to communicate that kind of message. Yeah. Of course, the perception in here, as well as in some parts and quarters of the world, they believe that Nairobi is decidedly partisan towards SAF,
yes,
in part because it allowed for formation of a parallel government in Nairobi. Now, here's another thing, though, that I think Kenyans and other people should also pay attention to. Now, that parallel government, as there is a challenge anytime, especially RSF is mentioned, in part because of having roots in the Janjaweed, that is accused of having committed, the genocide, in Darfur. But increasingly, there's been an evolution, and I'm not holding brief for the RSF. Now, I think the arrangement in Nairobi was also an attempt by RSF to show inclusivity. Because one of the things that some of us have been doing is to ensure that the discourse in Sudan is not just between the men and women with arms, but is where are the civilians, where are the people. And so this attempt to bring in the people, perhaps to get some kind of legitimacy, is also can be seen from that perspective as moving towards inclusivity. Because ultimately, we do not want Sudan to be ruled by arms alone. We want the civilians to return to the discourse where people like Hamdok can actually become, come at the center, instead of us just talking about Hemedi or Al-Burhan.
Yeah, and Dr. Gidua, then in a world where flexibility is required in the diplomatic den, how do you maintain the principle of neutrality, which we seem to have lost in the attempt to stabilize Sudan?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I'll piggyback on what Dr. Kaneji has talked about. It is in the optics, and trust me, optics is everything even in global politics. Kenya is a member of IGAD. Sudan is in IGAD. Kenya was expected, having helped to birth the CPA agreement in 2005. So Kenya we already had a head start in terms of creating peace and bringing about peace in the region. The fact that now Kenya allowed RSF to come on our soil and, launch the parallel government. And I'm glad that Dr. Kaneja has brought in the issue of inclusivity. The issue is in conflict resolution, the mediator needs to appear to be neutral, regardless of whatever other biases you might have, because granted, everybody has their own interests. It is in that optics that Kenya is taking a beating from the international perspective, because we were supposed to appear neutral. How? The fact that Burhan had already declared that he does not want Kenya's president to be part of, to be the main mediator, and was preferring President Salva Kiir from South Sudan to take up that mantle. I think Kenya should have ceded that, and in the interest of peace, because remember, if the people who are fighting call you biased, it means they will never listen, no matter how good your ideas are. And we have very good seasoned negotiators like retired General Sumbeyo. Regardless of whatever we brought, the fact we were a poisoned chalice from the word go. So on the optics and on the strength of conflict resolution, we should have taken a back seat. In the interest of peace, probably told RSF, you cannot hold your meeting here. Let's go to a more neutral party, more neutral ground, facilitate them if that's what is required, because then Kenya can never tell Sudan anything in its current constitution.
Yeah, I mean, how did we then lose the footing here? Because if you look at how we have midwifed the
CPA,
recently the TPLF federal government of Ethiopia, because look at the destinations chosen: South Africa, then finally Nairobi, and then into Addis in Ethiopia. I mean, if that was the template, then how did we lose it on the Sudan?
I think we lost it, from my perspective. I think we lost it by appearing like we're listening to one side or listening to one side more than the other. All right. Maybe, I don't know, and my colleagues will tell me, maybe we should have also invited Burhan and told him, come here and let's give you a platform to also air your views and say whatever you need. Because appearing like we are siding with one side, and it is the side that is tainted. Yeah. And this was coming fast on the heels of the fact that RSF and its leader Hemeti had been sanctioned, and the top leadership had been sanctioned. So remember, this is global politics. Optics matter. All right? Not very many people are going to go behind the scenes like Dr. Kaneja to find out what's really happening on the ground. What people see is what they get, is what they assume, is what they pick up. So we should have just not allowed, in my perspective, allowed RSF to do what they did, because to undo the damage, to undo the damage that has already tainted Kenya, and with its good peacekeeping and pursuing peace record, that damage, I'm not saying it is irreparable, but it will make us ineffective in solving the Sudan conflict.
Yes, Ahmed,
the deputy president himself said that he was ordered to sign an invitation letter to the RSF. But these are not my words, and nobody should be shocked at what I'm saying. It's in the public domain. And that the allegation was that the RSF was involved in the elections in this country, or had strong support for Mr. Ruto, the candidate. And therefore, this was payback time to give him backward. Now, you cannot run the foreign affairs of this country like uji, making uji in the kitchen. It's not the way to run foreign affairs. We do know that the RSF was a criminal organization. It should be, I think it's going to the Hague. Hameti is responsible for massive human rights abuses in the Sudan. And he is also responsible for massive human rights abuse in Darfur. He was the main man in the Janjaweed that was killing African people with a color like mine. Because he claims to be an Arab of some sort. And that man is responsible for grave injustice in the Sudan. The second thing is that the fact that the government of Kenya had a hand with a man who is an international fugitive not only bamboozles our perky stage in the international community, it makes a mockery of our foreign affairs in this country. And it's unprecedented. I've worked in that place, and I've never, ever seen anything like this. Secondly, if you want to know that it is the United Arab Emirates which is funding conflict in Sudan. This is just a fact now. We don't have to allege it. It is bringing a lot of arms through N'Djamena in Chad to try and give the RSF an upper hand in the western region of Sudan. And I think there's going to be conflict between Chad and the military of Sudan very soon. The UAE is not only there, it is over in Somalia, in Bosaso, where it has got radars and troops monitoring the Yemeni peninsula. So we as Africans or people in the eastern seaboard of Africa have to decide whether we're going to allow people to come into our region and play a hegemonic game on our foreign policy, or we are going to be responsible for places like South Sudan, places like Sudan. And another thing is, it looks like President Ruto is playing a card that is really unacceptable. You know, South Sudan has got all the constituencies, all the ethnic groups that are in Kenya, Kalenjin, the Luo, the Morule, who are called the Kalenjins there. And you know, South Sudan is in the vital national security of our country. So we in Kenya fought, and rightly so, defended South Sudan because of the 2 million people that were slaughtered there because of their ethnic background. And it was a just thing for us to do that. But it is clear now that the division of the Sudan is the main problem of the Sudan. And if they were divided into two, then the north has gone now down the drain, the south is still following. And I think that Kenya has completely derogated its duty to the region. And I think it's really important that we stand with the people of Sudan, which is the largest humanitarian crisis in Africa since 1960. It's bigger even than the Somali crisis.
And possibly even the world now, given the zero fraction of attention that it's getting, as well as the treatment of when the peoples are either Africans or Asians, and of course the coverage accorded to the conflict in Europe regarding Russia and Ukraine. Prof, Dr. coming to you, Maxwell, and all this happening at a time when the president had concluded his state visit to China, and we at this point want to hear from what he said. This was before he departed for Beijing for the state visit, where he was accorded the red carpet by President Xi in China, and thereafter flew to the Vatican for the burial of Pope Francis. This is what the head of state said at State House before his departure.
There is increasing potential and pressure to leverage on this South-to-South cooperation between the countries in the global South. And BRICS is an option for Kenya. We are looking at the opportunities that come with membership of BRICS.
Daktari, it appears then BRICS, he meant Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Of course, other countries were incorporated, amongst them Saudi Arabia. How does he trade this? And you mean he was treated to a red carpet treatment at the White House before Biden left office, and she, on the other end, had just done the same for him. I mean, how does he navigate?
I think President Ruto really knows what he's talking about. And what he's talking about is in recognition of the global economic realities today as we speak. The global economic realities today, one facet of it is that you need a new form of multilateralism, one that has got mutual respect, mutual understanding, and mutual cooperation. One that is not based on a colonial praxis of tutelage. And I think I said this in Washington. A colonial practice of tutelage, you would see reactions such as tariff, sanctions on diplomats. You'll see excessive levels of American economic nationalism, which are all forms of a reaction to the reality that the imperial hegemonic America's global power is in decline, and I may want to add that it is in rapid decline. Okay, so I think the other thing that Ruto does really understand is that you have to form critical alliances, you know, with people who are going to treat you with mutual respect, not those who will come up or try to craft or construct global economic policies based on domestic interests or domestic political interest. Let me tell you, you see, all this discourse by Trump on tariffs, you know, sanctioning global diplomats, is all as a result of the reality that America is can no longer be actually a leading manufacturing power, a leading economic power, and very soon a leading military power. And the figures are out there. I mean, 20 years ago, you know, China only had a manufacturing capacity of 8% of the world. Right now, it controls 30%. America 20 years ago was controlling 20%. Right now, I'm told it's controlling less than 3%. Okay? So Ruto has great insights into these economic realities of the decline of the West, okay, and the rise of the rest. That is why these economic alliances that he wants to form really is to the benefit of the people of Kenya in terms of the great, and China, by the way, is right now financing most of our infrastructural development. Very soon they're going to go into manufacturing, okay? Now, people may say that is a political strategic mistake. You know, how do you balance the West and the South or the East? You know, in terms of the levers of power. You know, because people still believe that there are great economic and military power differentials. But the reality is out there, okay? In the contemporary world in which we need today, particularly where we need trade, you know, we need economic support, economic cooperation. You know, we may not necessarily need that military aid in the long run. So I think President Ruto has actually taken advantage of these new economic realities.
Okay. Dr. Kaneje, is that so? And can America be easily discarded as a strategic ally?
You know, first of all, you know, I will differ just slightly with my colleague.
Me too.
America is not in rapid decline.
Yeah.
Is in relative decline as a result of the rise of the rest.
Yes.
As you mentioned. Is still by far the most powerful country
in the world. Yes.
It has the amount of soft power that is still unparalleled.
Yeah.
You know, and that is going to remain for some time to come.
Yeah.
You know, Hollywood is not going away anytime soon. And we can even chant death to America and we're still wearing I love New York.
Yes.
You know, that's how much has gotten into our psyche.
When they do manufacture nothing?
He'll come to that. Wait.
I'll come to that. And I'll come to that, you know, perhaps I can share with you.
It's an interesting debate.
In 2023, I was actually in that great hall of the people.
Yes, I remember.
So I'm pretty clear, and I happen to have lived in the US for more than a decade.
Yes.
13 years or so. So I have a pretty good sense, you know, of these kind of discussions. Now, what, of course, is happening is not just that, it's not our recognition. This is something we recognized in 2003 as a country. That is why we started the Look East policy at the time. Now, that does not mean we isolated the West, because we have strategic partnerships that go back years. And we have fundamental aspects in terms of the way we build networks with the West that are not going away anytime soon, including how we think, how we craft things. However, the reality that now the rise of the rest, especially led by China or the BRICS Plus, you know, because the BRICS Plus, that's what we have now, and that it is the manufacturing capital of the world. They make roads and infrastructure better than any other country right now, and faster, more efficient and cheaper. I went through many, many cities, and you'll find one city that is producing like 25% of the world products just in that.
Amazing.
You understand?
Okay.
You know,
amazing.
And so the future is East in terms of industry and manufacturing and export. The better part of the last 20 years, the Asia-Pacific region has led the world, you know, global, you know, economy. Now today is Asia-Pacific, then you come to Africa, then the Americas, then Europe this year is projected, EU, for instance, to grow at only 0.4%. for instance. So yes, this also recognition of the realities. But also there's another fundamental thing. I was happy, impressed that the Kenya Airways, the ones that landed there, and we could see it, and so there are no controversies with regard to what jet the president used. But there are certain, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects, there are things that Beijing can do that other countries can actually not be able to do. One of the things that I find also, I think, interesting is last year, was it when we visited Washington?
Yes.
We got a very big reception, but the type of commitments did not exactly speak in terms of transformation, the way, for instance, the type of commitment that we've made. And we have seen certain results, from China. And what I suspect is this, and I know my colleague Hashi doesn't see 2027 as happening, but if these things were implemented, remember, it's not just the 100 or so billion shillings, it's the 4.5 billion that's supposed to put infrastructure all the way to Uganda.
Yeah.
If this thing, for instance, happens, the amount of jobs it may create and transformation it may allow, it may actually also boost even the president's own campaign in terms of saying, I've delivered something. And so, while politically it may be beneficial, from economic terms, it holds perhaps one of the greatest potential in the last few years of transforming this economy as we know it.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Gidwa. Yes. I'll come to you, Ahmed.
Yeah, so countries are deemed as rational actors. That means before any country does anything in the world of international relations, there's a cost-benefit analysis. My perspective is that, and I like what Dr. Kaneja said, as you're making new friends, do not isolate the old ones. So at any one time, you don't want to move 10 steps forward, 15 steps backwards. So that cost-benefit analysis, that's a delicate balancing act in the world of international relations. What do I want to get from this place and that I cannot get from this place? Those are the deep questions the nation states ask at any given time. So were we right in going to China? Yes, because granted, there are things that the Chinese will do at a price point that nobody else will do. But at the same time, you also do not want to isolate your old partners. So it is very delicate. So you are allowed, your sovereignty allows you to make friends. Nobody can come and demonize Kenya for having friends anywhere in the world. Because Kenya has all those friends because of whatever interest it is pursuing from those friends. So for me, the advice that I always give is that do that cost-benefit analysis. You're a rational actor. What are you getting from China that you cannot get from the West? And what can the West give you that China cannot give you? That's why, if you ask me, the West is good for Africa. The West is good for Kenya because of certain things, because of their democratic principles, and they hold us to account and all that. China and the East is good because they will give us, quality things, but at the cheapest price. So if you ask, was it right or wrong? It was not. The answer there is, what are our interests? Okay. What do we want to achieve as a country? And who can give it to us at the least cost while giving us quality at the same time? But remember, in diplomacy, it is that delicate balancing act. Don't make new friends at the expense of the old ones. Like the Swahili say, don't despise the midwives, and people are still getting pregnant. Yes. So yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The great and ultra right-wing conservative theorist of international political economy, Henry Kissinger, said that an empire does not go out of its way to build an international system. An empire wants to be the international system. So we have to get an analysis of international political economy right before we can make some points about it. So the United States is effectively an empire. But the rise of the periphery, the rise of a counter-hegemony, did not rise on its own. The United States global finance was critical in investing in China and making global finance trillions of dollars out of the Chinese miracle. It is not only the Chinese who lifted 600 people out of poverty. It is global finance that has got something to do with that. So that's one thing. So and the second thing is that the United States political economy, of its philosophy about the world, is a neoliberal disciplinary hegemon. And it wants to put that everywhere in the world. It has failed in Ukraine. Liberal hegemony has failed in Ukraine. It's out. They are going to make peace. And Ukraine is going to lose big time. That shows you the limits of empire, because the Russians and the Chinese and the other little players got together and stopped it. And they said, "This, you cannot go past this." You know that the United States has got hundreds of military bases across, from Japan,
720,
all the way to Europe. And Europe is crying over this lack of protection. The difference between the administration of Donald Trump and, say, Biden, for an example, is that Donald Trump feels that other people have to take up the weight of some of the things that the Americans are doing. It does not mean that he's ejected. He's going to be an isolationist. The United States cannot be an isolationist because it is such a profound power. But he wants the responsibility for some of the weight to be taken by Europe and to be taken by the other groups. I'll give you a specific African example. The head of the military of CENTCOM went in front of the Joint Congress, Defense and Foreign Affairs, and he said that they want to overthrow our son, I cannot use any other word apart from that, Captain Traoré, who has decided to change his country, unlike us, and brought agriculture back, brought investment back. He's fixing his gold. He's refused...
Spelling the French.
Yeah, he's refused neocolonialism. He's building the Sahel Union. He's showing that it is possible for us to create something called a counter-hegemony. And this is the concept, not my concept, this is a concept of the Southern Italy philosopher called Antonio Gramsci. So if you want to build counter-hegemony, you do it the way Mr. Captain Traoré, a 35-year-old captain in the army. I put it to you, Ayub, that it depends today in the political economy of world politics. There is a very important concept that I believe it must be used, and that is bringing the global south together. Mr. Hazakadenji is an expert on that issue. And when you bring the global south together, you provide a bulwark against being run over by the United States. You remember when Gamal Abdel Nasser, Allah Yarhamah, and all Tito and all provided the third tenet in international relations, the non-aligned movement, and how that was so important to Africa. Today, the African Union is not speaking about Burkina Faso because we have not built this global hegemony, counter-hegemony, and it is very important for us to understand that Trump is going to take his sword. He doesn't want to, his relationship with Kenya is very bad. He doesn't want to deal with William Ruto. William Ruto saw this and he's gone to China. China already knows that. China's investment in this country, you know, is not the one that leaves us with something to do. It sucks us completely. They even brought Chinese prison labor here once to build the Thika Road. So what we need to do is to develop East Africa. What is the University of Nairobi doing if they cannot build a railway from here to Uganda? You remember the coolies and the British are the ones who built that road. What is this University of Nairobi people doing there if they can't put these blocks together and build a road for us? What is it that we cannot build about these trains from the 1960s and the 1970s? We have to take responsibility for our country and our region, Ayub.
Yeah, and Dr. Maxwell, coming to you, by far, China is Kenya's biggest lender, and so it's also by far America's biggest lender. And this,
yes, that's true.
Yeah, the statistics say it has $3.3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves and sovereign wealth funds of $2.5 trillion. US dollars. And an expert at the China Center for Globalization said, ours is not about conquering, taking lands, or telling people what to do, unlike the Americans, as Ahmed had said, and in what seemingly is apparently leading us to the direction of clash of civilizations. Is that what's partly contributing to America's rapid decline in your view and relative decline in the words of Dr. Kanenji? I
think I'm the only one who has disagreed with the whole entire panel in terms of the extent and degree of America's decline. Well, and I want to maintain, and by the way, serious and top global thinkers have made this comment. Jeffrey Sachs and all professors, a number of professors. And of course, they are telling this in the face of Donald Trump. Okay, of course, they do not have the disadvantage of being deported. But let's take it from where you've left. And he was talking about the concept of counter-hegemony. I think 10 years ago, China, and this is why China has advanced a great deal, came up with an open-ended, forward-look thinking global policy in terms of its economic programs and so forth. At the same time, and I think America's, that was the time, at least one can say, that the recognition of the reality that if you cannot have capital, human capital, you cannot produce labor, and even your technology is somewhat lagging, then to what extent can one say that you are still a global economy? You know, the world is dealing with quite a number of crises apart from climate change. Some of the global threats we have today is global indebtedness. Yeah. Okay? That is the reason why Kenya is turning east. Because we still have a colonial practice of tutelage where if you're looking for investment capital, you're still confronted with policies of the old past, structural adjustment programs, conditionalities, and so forth. We still, certain countries are facing serious crisis of aging population. Europe, America, by the way, it will come here very soon.
Japan.
You know, Japan and so forth. You cannot still believe that these are not declining powers if you do not have labor. It means, therefore, you do not have manufacturing. Okay? The other global crisis, of course, that we still have
yes,
is the protectionism today by Americas. Okay, or restrictions on trade. So one can actually point at a great deal of contrast between the East and the West, or the South and the North. This is also happening in Europe. You know, when you're closing your borders to people coming in, it is a recognition of the reality that, you know, these are people who are coming to pollute our economy, to take away our jobs, when actually your own population cannot do those jobs, particularly the unskilled jobs. Okay? So one can see a great deal of contrast of isolationism of America and multilateralism of the East that is based on mutual understanding, mutual cooperation, okay, and mutual partnership. One can also see the protectionism by Americas. Well, the Chinese are opening their borders. Okay. And that is the reason why actually today even China is the greatest lender in Kenya today. I'm told, yeah, almost at 64%.
Yes.
You know, so really we have to really rethink international economics at this particular time. And I think one person who understands this very, very deeply, making the choice between the East and the West, is William Ruto. Given the current global trends, and particular domestic and political interests that are there in the West. Yeah. Trump is actually just a trumpeter of the economic realities within his own country. You know, if you cannot produce labor, you cannot manufacture, you know, if your population is aging, if all your universities are almost 70% foreigners, my friend, you know, how can you still be a global power?
Yes. And Dr. Kanenje, what's then Kenya and Africa's share in the world given the available labor in place and how that can be tapped? Just looking at these statistics from Niraj Koshal of Columbia University, who has observed that in the past decade, America has overtaken France, which has the highest number of black population in Europe, as the country with the largest population of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, Kenyans included. Africa's share of immigration to America has risen from less than 1% in 1960, that's more than 65 years ago, to 11% at the height of the pandemic in 2020. Net migration from the Caribbean and Africa in the 2010s was twice as high as Latin America. 4 times more Africans arrived in America between 1990 and 2020 during the slave trade. I mean, how will this contribute? Nigerians, Ethiopians, Ghanaians, Kenyans, Sudanese, these are all, if you go to states like Georgia, where you will find, in fact, they have an African day called Africa Diaspora Day in Atlanta, Georgia, where Congolese, Ethiopians, Rwandans, Kenyans, Nigerians meet there. I mean, how then can we partake in the progress of the global economy given the labor available here and the needed reconstruction of our leadership?
Yeah, I think first of all it's important to clarify a few things. In the, I think, entire Western world, the U.S. is the only place where it doesn't have an aging population, actually. It,
Europe
it has,
the United States, yeah.
Exactly, the United States. And a lot of it has been driven by immigration. And because immigration, people like us, as well as Latinos and others, they tend to have more families. That is why some states like California have become a minority majority state. And according to predictions, by 2042, the United States is going to be a minority majority, country, meaning the white population or Anglo-Saxon are going to become, for the first time, shorter, or rather fewer. And so that trajectory in the U.S., I think is going to continue now, unless they completely change the immigration laws in a way in which they stop immigration completely. But that has been the genius that even created the Silicon Valley. Now, about Africans. Until very recently, I don't know if the data has changed, but African immigrants were actually the most highly educated immigrants in the United States, by far. I'm not talking about African Americans, I'm talking about African immigrants. Better than the Asians and others, they were most highly educated. They tended to hold higher jobs, more sophisticated kind of engagements. And how best can we be able to make use of this? Now, that also depends with the new framework that is going to be set up. Now, the United States created the system that we have in the world today, whether it's trade or business. Now, Trump seems to be actually working against the system that the United States created. Immigration has been the engine. There is no top business person, tech person in the United States who actually does not support H-1B visa, because they know the Silicon Valley was created. There won't be Google, there won't be Yahoo, there won't be all that. When you go to top universities in the United States, most of it, in terms of PhDs, sometimes as much as 90%, are kind of foreign-born. Now, where the challenge is right now for the U.S. when it comes to the future, I've mentioned about decline, is unlike previously, when these people came and they were handed green cards and they stayed, right now they are coming and going back to their home country to set up their own Silicon Valleys. Two, because of labor challenges, it has become easier to send jobs to India in terms of outsourcing. If you live in the United States, if you ever called for tech support, you probably spoke to someone in India, And I think Bill Gates one time mentioned that, per square kilometer I can get 1,000 programmers in New Delhi.
Yes.
I'm going to struggle to get them in Wyoming, to get even 2. And so that, because of this globalization thing, has actually changed the equation. And so for Africans, they can still explore opportunities, especially in the wake of others not exactly wanting to risk, but also the emerging opportunities in their own countries, whether it's in Asia or Europe, where they actually want to stay and perhaps seek some more opportunities to go to the United States. Now, we know that ultimately Donald Trump is going to negotiate some of these rules, whether they're immigration or tariffs. In fact, one thing that is lost is he gave exemptions to electronics, other tech equipment from China, which forms the bulk of actually the trade between the United States, and China, because it realizes
$400 billion a year.
Yes, that Dell, American company, HP, Hewlett Packard, formerly led by Meg Whitman, you understand?
Yes.
They are made in China by the American companies, and so if you're going to impose those tariffs, that means an iPhone Pro Max will be worth $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 instead of maybe $600. You see, now that's going to make life increasingly difficult because it goes against all the principle of free trade. So how can Africans make use of this?
Yes.
When we simply have to exploit the crisis that is going on and see how we can strike deals, because Trump is transactional.
Yes.
Yes, Ahmed, I'll come to you. Yes.
I think that Africa has got the high-end minerals, and the high-end minerals are the basic ingredients of the fourth revolution, the technological revolution. And I think that with the right political direction, with the right state class, I think that it is very possible for those minerals and other sectors of the economy to absolutely transform the economies of Africa. And I think that one of the reasons why Mr. Trump has decided to support the DRC is because the DRC has got these high-end minerals that are critical to the automotive, they're critical to the production of phones, they're critical critical. For an example, the Horn of Africa and Kenya too has the largest ores of these critical materials. And I think that if the political class and the economic class in the region put their heads together, we can start thinking of building an East African economy while at the same time dealing with the international community on issues of precious minerals. Because the Middle East developed a second-level economy through oil. And I think that if we take our minerals and put some value to it, I think that we will be critical to the supply chain. But that takes leadership in the region. Where you have to create the hubs for this, you have to create the technological schools for it, you have to create the brains for it, and you have to critically have the leadership on it. Mr. Traore is doing that in Burkina Faso. In the Sahel Union, they are pulling their resources together and bringing companies that are going to create this, and they're having sharing of this production. In Kenya, we cannot continue to have an economy of pyrethrum, flowers, and coffee. We have to transform the economy so that our politics changes. And I want to put to my friends that today in the international community, there's no question in my mind that the liberal hegemony is not dead. It has been stopped somewhere. It has been stopped in the military situation in the Crimea, and because Russia has ballistic missiles, and Russia and China simply put its economy at the disposal of the Russians. Everything that was on the sanctions, the Chinese gave to the Russians. And this just showed that there are limits to what American power and hegemony can do. I lastly want to say that what is the role of Africa in this new transformative 21st century economy? It is very important for the political class to know that they can no longer be just hangers-on to the international system, and that they need to transform.
Yeah, and Dr. Gidua, yesterday when the Prime Cabinet Secretary appeared before the Senate, he said that there was a malicious attempt by MPs to travel to Taiwan during President Ruto's visit to China. He said, we know there were some people who are pushing to have a delegation from Parliament to go to Taiwan when the President of Kenya is visiting China for the state visit. It could have cost the country a lot. What does this tell us about our leadership's understanding of how diplomacy and the dynamics of the world order works?
All right, yeah. I mean, I was also shocked when I heard him say that because, I mean, Kenya knows about the one China policy. I mean, the world knows. Would expect, the Foreign Affairs definitely would know that. And whichever leadership or whichever parliamentarians wanted to do that, malicious intent, yes, the timing was very wrong. You cannot do that. There is this one China policy where Taiwan is, globally speaking, Taiwan is still a part of China. And China is very, very clear on anybody who tries to give recognition to Taiwan. China always comes down hard on them. It would have embarrassed our president, of course, definitely, if the delegation was allowed to have gone. The malicious intent, of course, you interpret it from the perspective of who exactly are these who, knowing that the president was going to China, was it that they had planned to go to Taiwan before, or was it in the midst of that delegation, that visit? If at all, and I'm glad they did not go, if at all the Kenyan parliamentarians had gone to Taiwan when the president is in China, I am telling you, we would have walked out with nothing. That's for sure. So back to your question. That shows our lack of understanding, to an extent, our lack of patriotism. Because, yes, granted, the president has gone to China. He has gone to negotiate. Sabotaging him while he's there, it is not just him you're sabotaging, it is the country. You're going to create irreparable damage between Kenya and China. It was not going to be about whichever administration went there. It is just about the mishandling of the whole thing. So I'm happy they did not go, because that would have cost a diplomatic smart, a very huge one.
And Dr. Miawa, even from the American perspective, when President Nixon landed aboard Air Force One in China for the first time in 1972, a hand note he left in the Boeing 747, which was later on archived, had his handwritten note indicated he was irritated by Taiwan and believed in the one China policy. Of course, Mao, as Zedong at the time, was willing to engage on the Taiwan aspect. But what does this tell us about understanding, comprehending the history of how the world works from our leaders, those who are at the foreign policy, I mean, at our foreign affairs, and generally how we also critically think around the everyday events which happen around the world?
I think history, some significant aspect of history has been lost to the current global leaders. And this takes us to around 1943. We can call it conceptually the post-1945 global order. The post-1945 global order is one based on multilateralism. And you could see one of the fundamental aspects of multilateral, of course, global cooperation, global partnership for the benefit or for developmentalism. You need everybody to be within that ship, okay? You need not to antagonize everyone. Look at what the international economic system that was crafted post-1945, the IMF, the World Bank. Look at the UN and the UNDP and all these other institutions that came. It underscores the fact that a new developmentalism, particularly the one post-1945 that was crafted by Americans, that Americans took advantage of, needed one global economic order, and not a splintered one that causes antagonism, or one that is based on antagonism or isolationism. You know, when you're talking about Taiwan on the one hand and China on the one hand, what does it tell you? If we are talking about of a splintered global order, that is not what the Americans crafted post-1945, okay? Even at the time when you're looking at the kind of a global development project that Harry Truman, you know, was speaking about at the time. He was talking about welfare, the development of the rest. There cannot be two rests, you know, because China was still part, is still actually very part of the rest. China on the other side and Taiwan on the other, and the Africans on the other side. So we need global cooperation. We need not to have a splintered group within the global economy. Yeah,
but is that a policy America believes in? If you look at the hawkish foreign policy, for example, deposing Saddam Hussein, an illegal war concocted before the United Nations, the aspect about the lies about WMDs, you look at Afghanistan in 2001, you look at Libya, which Obama regretted. In fact, his foreign affairs Secretary Hillary Clinton had rather expressed a sigh of relief when she was told Gaddafi was killed in state in 2011. I mean, if then its engagements are more or less seen as destabilization of society across the world, how then does it offer that much needed balance as a hegemon?
That's why we say that the contemporary America keeps on churning out their fundamentally flawed global policies, whether they are foreign policies, whether they are international trade policies, whether they are foreign policies, or any other policies, because America has lost touch with the reality of the contemporary society. Okay? America still lives in the yesteryears, you know, in the shadows of yesteryears, and perhaps hangovers of being a global power for the next so many years. That reality is what the American leadership that does not internalize. Yeah. That is the reason why every other project, you know, every other military project has backfired on them. You know, if you mentioned the example of Libya, it's a very pathetic and a tragic one, actually. Okay? It is that's why these policies will say they are fundamentally flawed. For Africans, therefore, you know, we are talking about the splintering, the global policies. We really need to advise that going forward, they need to take advantage of, you know, integration in their economic policies. At a time when these trade wars, you know, tariff wars are going on. The other reality, perhaps, that Americans are not understanding, this is a sad one. You know, in 1776, Adam Smith wrote about what? The wealth of nations. And of course, he was talking about specialization. Later on, I think in 1887, somebody came to write about comparative advantage, at least economically speaking, in terms of global economic, David Ricardo, 1887. How is it that this consciousness, these insights have been lost on the global leaders in the contemporary society, where there are deep internal economic challenges? Okay? How is it that America go on to bring their own labor, human capital, manufacturing in their own country? Okay. at a time when in 1776 you had been told about specialization. You cannot be a jack of all trades, do manufacturing, be a military leader, bring global capital and all these other things. I think there's there should be, or there ought to be, a rethinking of global economic policies when we have the right global leaders in place. I know my colleagues will challenge that.
Yes. Let me go to Dr. Kaneja. Yes, Dr. Kaneja, and also as you couple it up with the relevance of NATO when we were given that status by the Biden administration, the major NATO ally, joining the leagues of the likes of Israel and the other countries that enjoy that. But Donald Trump doesn't believe in that. He says Europe should defend itself and not depend on American taxpayer to for its own security.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the previous point you've mentioned with regard to Kenya's parliamentarians visiting
Taiwan. Yes, please.
Would say that has to do a lot with regard to lack of understanding of statecraft and national interest. And perhaps lessons should be given to every new parliamentarians when it comes to foreign policy and national interest for the country in going forward, because there is a dearth, in that. Now, Donald Trump says, Europe should take care of itself, and well, he has a point. Part of the argument a lot of us have had is the absence of strategic autonomy when it comes to European foreign policy. And that has, by and large, made them vessels of certain leaders, especially in Washington, so whether they were good or they were bad.
Okay.
And so that developing agency, I think, is going to be important for European security, but also for Europe to play a more instrumental role. Now, I don't think NATO is going to collapse. There are a lot more facets that, of collective security that has informed in that grouping. The U.S. still, spends $700 to $800 billion on military, and they still have 700 bases around the world.
Huge.
So that is not, it's exactly wishful thinking. Europe, while they're going to boost, and starting by Germany, I think right now is the top spender in Europe. The economies cannot sustainably right now, be able to meet some of the desires and the designs they have for military enlargement and expansion. When you're growing at 0.2, 0.4%, you cannot be able to sustain that. Now, I do agree with regard to the relevance of NATO, for instance, in the modern world. This is an outfit was created in response to what perceived threat that came from the Warsaw Pact, of course, which Poland, was part of. Now, that pact is largely absent. Now, unless we're now focusing on, let's say, the rise of China as well as others as a potential threat. The role it was meant to play had really died for about 30 years. It was insignificant. And so Donald Trump saying, people should take care of themselves, and he's not just saying that to Europe, he's saying that to us. And perhaps the biggest mistake, while he may be right in terms of focus on America first, taking away US aid, for instance, was actually a biggest blow, not just to countries who were recipients, but that was the biggest soft power tool by the United States around the world, in a way in which you can reach communities, in a way in which you can be able to collect intelligence, in a way in which you can be able to connect with people in other aspects. In terms of soft power, it was massive, even though it's a wake-up call. Now, I think the world needed Donald Trump to wake up in terms of building autonomy as well as independence, but also increasing the end agency, whether it's in regional affairs or global affairs.
Okay. Yes, Ahmed, and then Dr. Gidwa.
Well, I think that the institutions of the post-war 1945 are an expression of the cultural hegemony of the United States after it broke up the Sterling area when the British imperialism went down. I think these institutions are the ones that keep up the rules-based system in the world, in which the core directs how international political economy is going to move forward. However, I think that we are now at a breaking point in the modern world. It has been made very clear by the old German philosopher that nobody likes to talk about, that capital is very antagonistic. And capital, the Chinese capital, the Japanese capital, Japan is also arming itself, and the European capital are all now antagonistic to each other. And it is through these decisive institutions that were created under the Atlantic Charter that mediate mediate international political economy, and also organic intellectuals like Mearsheimer, all the other intellectuals who buttress this system of a rules-based system. Mr. Mearsheimer is probably the best, the most important writer today on international political economy. However, as a response, as Africans, we have to find a way in which we not only respond and be a reaction, but we have to find out how we're going to come together.
Yes.
And the Sahel Union is showing us how we can build organic economies, how we can cooperate, how we can stand up to this hegemony, and how we can produce goods and products and jobs for our people. We cannot just think of being part of this expression of hegemony, but we have to find a way in which we can overcome it and create our own ways of moving forward.
Yes,
it's very important.
Yeah, my view is I look at Trump and where he's taking the world into. I am seeing that he's a bitter pill the world will have to swallow, his policies and his outlook. Because increasingly I view him as an isolationist when the world should be moving into greater multilateralism. And my fear is, we were discussing this with some students somewhere, and someone even said he could be a mole. Maybe he's a mole planted to help the US crumble much faster. Maybe he's just Putin's stooge or someone. But the thing is, Trump's policies are leading the US into a bit of isolationism because he's rocking the boat. Europe is now beginning to rethink its relationship with the US. Other countries, the Asia Pacific, when now Japan starts talking about we need an Asia NATO, we are going to rearm ourselves, get our own nuclear weapons. Trump has shaken the world in my way, from my perspective, in a negative way, because there should be always elements in foreign policy of continuity and change. Incrementalism, even if you want to change your policies, don't be so drastic until even your own allies begin questioning your intentions.
Thank you. Let's now sample the feedback, gentlemen, here, and bring the curtains onto the show. Here's what we are saying on X, the hashtag is Citizen Daybreak. Gode Barasaware says our current administration and political class seem constantly engaged in controversy, confusion and chaos. These distractions provide them with opportunities to play politics and maintain their relevance. Things must change. Nixon Ndugure says gambling with diplomacy matters can easily throw nations into terrible chaos. It's true that diplomacy is more than saying or doing the right things at the right time. It's avoiding saying or doing the wrong things at any time. Sawe says the Gen Z protests were a cry for justice, but the elite couldn't bear the disruption to their feast, responding instead with fake jobs and endless lies. It's time for the youth to rise and stand on their own because the political class will not save them. Okelo Mwalimu says whether we look east or west, the real question we should be asking is what's the cost of these bilateral and multilateral deals? The ordinary mwananchi wants better living standards and minimal or at no cost. This cannot be achieved through endless borrowing. Eric Otondi says it's normal for children to fear the dark, but it's tragedy when adults fear the light. There can be no justice under a government that is obsessed with silencing the truth. Bob Otieno Wino says Kenya has long been a dependable ally of the West. President William Ruto's tour to the East, even with a bag of goodies, won't change much. It's driven more by political interest and positioning for his 2027 re-election campaign. The last one is Kisho Laban says the doublespeak surrounding Kenya's role in arbitrating the Sudan conflict, especially after the perceived bias in hosting the RSF to plot a parallel regime in Nairobi, is hardly the mark of a neutral mediator. Kenya is recklessly gambling with its foreign policy. Dr. Maxwell Miawa, thanks for your time. International Development Law Scholar fresh from Washington, where he was at the Johns Hopkins University for a talk. Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director at the Horn International Institute, thanks for your time. Ahmed Hashi, Governance Commentator, thanks for your time. Dr. Edgar Gidua, International Affairs, Diplomacy and Security Commentator.
And
Many thanks for your time.
Ayub, amazing discussion, and you're a bright spot in this country. Thank you for welcoming us.
Asante sana. Thanks to you too for waking up with us here on the broadcast. After the break here on Daybreak, the discussion continues, and we'll be talking about dental health here on the broadcast after the break on health and lifestyle. Stay with us.